event is called Tu Quien Eres. This is a legacy event that Adelante has every year. And through this event, we really try to discuss the many diverse labels that exist within the Latino community. And we try to do kind of make it something different every year, just bring something new to our campus. And this year, we hope that we are able to kind of dig in into what it means to be part of the Indigenous culture and how that is kind of put that into perspective among the Latino community. Just as a reminder, we really want to make this an interactive event. So if you could just please open your camera, utilize the chat function. There's also a raise your hand button that you can use just to make it more personable and make this experience the best for you all. So now we're going to dig into some of the labels that do exist within the Latino community.
Hello, everybody. My name is Daniela Maquera, and I am the Chief Financial Officer of Adelante, and I will be explaining the labels that are usually associated with the Latino Hispanic community, and we want to make a difference between the most commonly used labels, which are Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish. Hispanic usually relates and derives from Spain, and it's attributed to individuals from Spanish-speaking countries, which is the case for Bolivia and Ecuador. Countries like Brazil and French Guyana, which are not Spanish-speaking countries, would not fall under this category. However, Latino includes any person, individual who comes from the entire region of Latin America, regardless of the officially spoken language. And I say officially because it should be known that there is a variety of languages and dialects aside from Spanish within Latin America. And lastly, we have Spanish, which is both a language and a person from the country of Spain.
Okay, so now we'll be some of the newer labels that have arisen just from our just recent times. There has been more of a awareness of different identities that each individual has. So one of those first labels is the term Afro Latino, which refers to a person of at least partially African ancestry. And this is influenced by the historical context of the slave trade that really influenced Latin America, and it really influenced like different cultural elements that we find in today's different cultures. For example, it's influenced religion practices, foods, music, language, and even the arts. We also have the term Latinx, which refers to a person of Latin American heritage. But instead of using the Latino, Latina term, which usually refers to a male or a female specifically, this term allows there to be a more of a gender neutrality. Also, again, highlighting the pride of being able to identify with your own preference of sexuality and identity. And then we also have the term Afro Latinx, which is just a combination of both. Again, also highlighting the pride of African ancestry in Latin American culture, and as well as, once again, bringing back the gender neutrality and not just having terms as Latino or Latina, which are specific to a male and a female. Okay, so after we have discussed a little bit of the diversities of the labels that exist within the Latinx community, we really want to shift the focus of today's event to highlight Indigenous roots. I kind of want to emphasize how important our program kind of lies within our timeline today, especially with today being the culmination of Hispanic Heritage Month. We really want to kind of highlight our culture and our roots, and shed light on the cultures or the heritages that are not as much highlighted when we hear the term Hispanic Heritage Month, and also kind of want to shed light on the Columbus Day being observed in the United States. But we really want to bring an awareness of what this day should really mean and what we should really be celebrating. Rather than what is taught in our education system or what is taught in schools. So once again, we really want to highlight what it means to be part of the indigenous culture, and we really want to bring uh, first person perspectives of being part of this community. The way that we will be running this event is that Daniela and I will be moderating a panel which will be formed by three great speakers. We will be having a question and answer portion at the end. Therefore, we really encourage everyone to have their camera on and also have utilize the chat function as much as you can. If you don't feel comfortable speaking or doing the raise your hand button, we know that Teams can be a little bit difficult sometimes. So now we will move on to introducing our panelists.
So, for tonight, we have the pleasure to have three amazing panelists. Our first panelist on the line is Dr. Tapia. He's currently an associate professor in the Security Studies Department at King Fahd Security College in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He has previously worked as a guest lecturer for John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Seton Hall University. He obtained a PhD in Global Affairs from Rutgers University and had over a decade of government experience working as a special agent and intelligence officer for the U.S. Navy. Dr. Tapia, if you could wave at our audience and say a few words.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Daniela. Thank you, Adelante, for having me here. Kula Kitanaka, Hilatanaka, Kuna Mastasa. That is Aymara for brothers and sisters. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Dr. Tapia. Next on the line, we have Dr. Baez. She's an associate professor of Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies at Hunter College and affiliate faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies program at CUNY Graduate Center. Her research expertise lies in Latino, Latina, media, race, gender, and media literacy. She is the author of In Search of Belonging, Latinas, Media, and Citizenship, which was published by University of Illinois Press in 2018 and was awarded the Bonnie Reader Outstanding Book Award by the National Communication Association. Dr. Baez, if you could wave and say a few words.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much, especially to Daniela for working with all of us to prepare for the panel. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight. It's a really, really, it's a really, really important discussion that really needs to be had. And of course, it's so timely given that Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day just passed on Monday. So I'm excited. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baez. And next on the line, last but not least, we have Diana Salas. She is part of the undergraduate class of 2024 at the University of Pennsylvania. She intends to double major in international relations and economics. She's interested in the diplomatic, economic, and cultural relations between South American countries. She was born in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and she plans to use her education to get involved in Ecuadorian politics. Diana, could you please say a few words and wave at our audience?
Hello, I'm Diana. Thank you so much for having me today. I hope to provide some sort of anecdotal experience and add to the discourse of today. Thank you.
Thank you so much once again to each of our panelists. We're really looking forward to this event. So before we get started with the questions that are going to be directed specifically to our panelists, we want to engage you, our audience. So we are going to show a question on the screen for you to answer through a poll. The question is, when you hear the label Latino, Latina, Hispanic, what are roots or ethnic origins that come to mind? And if you could please look at, there's a link and a code that you can use to answer.
You can use your phone and go on the browser app and just put the link in and use the code. And then you can, once you start answering, the answers will populate onto the screen.
The answer will be shared anonymously, so don't worry about your answer being shared publicly. We won't know who gave what answer. This is for us to get a sense of what is your opinion before we get into our panelists' answers. So now we're seeing that some of the answers are Latin American roots, Caribbean culture, my culture, Spanish, African, indigenous roots, all mixed into one. Locations that speak Spanish. Let's wait a few more minutes or seconds, and then we are going to direct the question to our panelists and hear what they have to say.
Someone said Spanish-speaking countries and música de mi tierra, which I can definitely relate to.
Okay, so I think we can move on and ask the question to our panelists. What are some ethnic origins and roots that come to your mind when you hear the term Latino, Latina, Hispanic? Anybody would like to start us off?
I can start. And I apologize for the awkward silences. I'm still learning how to navigate here. When I hear Hispanic or Latino, I'm thinking, my initial thoughts are twofold. So one, I'm thinking of people of Latin American descent who are living in the U.S. Right, so it's not a term that I think of to describe people in Latin America. Right, these are people who are migrants themselves, or children of migrants, right, or grandchildren of migrants, who are based now in the U.S. So it's the first thing I think of when I see that. And then the other thing is, and I think I saw at least one response up there is I think about sort of our roots based on our history. So I'm thinking about how all of us are, and to different extents, and we'll talk about this more. I think of mestizaje, right? And this notion in Latin America, right, that we are racially mixed nations, right, coming from, we have European roots, largely like from Spain, but in the case of a place like Brazil, right, that could also mean Portugal, and there are other places in Latin America and the Caribbean that have been colonized by other European countries. But I think about that. I think about the indigenous presence, in Latin America. And that's something that, we'll get into later, but it's something that we don't quite talk about enough, and is very varied. There's a lot of differentiation within that in terms of culture, language, histories. And I also think about Blackness, right, in terms of, we tend to forget, or we may have never learned, right, that Latin America was a huge part of the Atlantic slave trade, right? And so, for example, Brazil had more slaves than the US, right? And that, I think, really changes our perception of thinking about race in Latin America, and the way that we think about roots, so to speak, in Latin America. So I think about all of those three, and I think what's complicated about this is I think that there's sort of thinking about mestizaje and thinking about us as mixed people. On the surface, that can seem like a really sort of beautiful, unifying sort of notion. But I also think sometimes there is some erasure there because there's a bit of specificity lost, right? Especially in terms of people's indigenous identities, and also to, just the erasure of Blackness, right, in certain countries. So, we'll get into that more, but those are the two things I think of. It being a US based term, right? Something that we really think about here. And then also thinking about it in terms of racial mixture.
For me, when it changes this concept of Latino Hispanic. It has changed for me over time. So, as a young individual, being born and growing up in the U.S., when people would talk about Hispanic and Latino, I would think about Univision, Channel 41, my parents, Goya, something that is so unknown, something I want to hide, something I don't identify because I'm also an American. And how could I combine these two things together? But as I grew older and mature, it's so much different. It's so inclusive, and it's everything you guys have mentioned. And this last term that you guys have talked about, Latinx, it is inclusive not only when it comes to gender, but the way I've seen it, and I spoke to some other of my colleagues. The X is it also. Why did Malcolm X have this X? Because he didn't know what his last name was, his real last name was. He could identify with his African roots. So Latin America has a history of blackness that has been erased, ignored. So that's the X. It's inclusive of our Afro roots. It's inclusive of our indigenous roots. People tend to forget that a lot of indigenous languages, Aymara, Quechua, Nahua, Mixteco, Guarani, they have the X. The X is so important for the language. So this is how I relate Latino, how it it transforms into something that we're seeing today. Thanks to you guys. Thanks to the work of so many people.
Um, so, growing up, the terms in Latino and Hispanic were foreign to me because the people around me described themselves as Ecuadorian. So I too adopted that identity. When talking about non-Ecuadorians, we refer to them by the countries that they were born, like Bolivian or Peruvian. So I did not know what it meant to be Latino or Hispanic. So I was aware that Ecuador was in South America, and I felt a sense of unity between other South American countries, but it was not enough to build a label with I could use to identify myself, and more so serve like as a geopolitical marker of our relationships rather than like a sense of community between different countries. So I first heard the terms Latino Hispanic when I came to America. When I was filling out paperwork for school, I was asked to identify my ethnicity and my race. So I asked my teacher to help me because I did not know what these different terms meant. And she chose to identify me as white as my race and my ethnicity to be Latino and Hispanic. And I remember looking at my parents, my father was a Black Ecuadorian and my mother an Indigenous Ecuadorian. And I told them that, this is not me. I don't understand what these different labels mean. And they said, this is America. This is just who we are now. So, but even then I didn't really understand. So I asked the lady, I said, I'm not white. But she said, you're Hispanic, so your race has to be white. And then that kind of time, like this idea that if you're Hispanic or Latino, that you have to identify your race as white, and that there is no different identity that you could be, or that your background has to kind of be erased to fit into this mold to make other people comfortable. But however, after having conversations and reading different things and different opinions, I have come to terms with the identity as a Black Indigenous Latina. And while the label Hispanic encompasses all Spanish-speaking countries, the ethnic origins that come to mind are Spain. The impact that Spain colonization is still seen today from the influence of culture, traditions, language, and religion that are still practiced in Hispanic countries. On the other hand, the roots and ethnic origins that come to mind when I hear the label Latino are indigenous and Black. The term Latino to me carries the history of the people in North, Central, and South America. This means that the people that were there before the Spanish colonized, or those that were untouched by the Spanish, like those people in Brazil. Um, Prior to the colonization of the Americas, there existed an indigenous population in the Americas, and this demographic later changed to include the Spanish conquistadores and the Black slaves that they brought to the Americas. Throughout time, through the interaction of these different races, these ethnic lines have blurred, and the true ethnicity of Hispanic and Latino people is relatively unknown because as the years have passed, one cannot say that they are 100% a certain race, because while we can identify with saying, I am indigenous or I am Black or I am a white Latino, we cannot be completely 100% sure, just as many other races or ethnicities, identities can also identify with not being completely sure 100% of like their ethnic background. So I think that, however, there are labels that we identify as the culture we grew up in, such as Black, Indigenous, and then more widely Latino and Hispanic.
Yes, I definitely, I think that the responses that our panelists have given really reflect the complexity and the intricacy that the term Latino, Hispanic really have. We just saw Black, Indigenous, of different types, different places, and now we want to focus our second question more on again the indigenous descent, and ask our panelists, when growing up, how and were you aware of your indigenous descent, and if so, how close or far did you feel from that indigenous descent?
Um, I have to say, for me, I think it's important to know my particular background and location to answer this question first, which is that I'm Puerto Rican. I was born and raised here on the mainland. I am, I guess, 1.5 generations. My mother was also born here in New York, and my father was born on the islands. Which made for a very interesting experience growing up in terms of very sort of different understandings of their own Puerto Rican and Latino identities. And I have to say, in terms of an indigenous identity, I was a bit removed on the one hand, because, within Puerto Rican culture, there is this notion of we're all part of la gran familia puertorriqueña, right? Like the big Puerto Rican family. And the idea is that we have, those three roots that I mentioned earlier, right? The European, the African, and the indigenous being specifically the Tainos, right? Who, historians had said were practically decimated, right? And the idea being that unlike other places in Latin America, for example, Mexico and Central America, in places like Peru and Bolivia, where there are indigenous communities that are still like tied to a particular place, right? And like physical community of actual living people and living languages. This was like very kind of like far removed. And one of the things that I think too, that was also hard for me to grapple with is, in my case, in terms of race, my mother was very light skinned, right? And could pass for like Anglo white, right? Not Hispanic white, but Anglo white. And on the other hand, my father is very dark skinned, right? And would not pass. As a matter of fact, he, often, when he served in the military, he had to serve with African Americans. And he sort of really struggled to sort of make sense of that, coming from the island and having brought his own ideas of race in Puerto Rico to the mainland. And at the same time, my father also often claimed like an indigenous identity. He was from Caguas, from a town that had sort of a strong sort of historical tie to Taino history. And I don't know how true that is. So I'm thinking here of, what Diana says, that this is one of those things that it's sort of like family myth, and you're not really sure like how true that is or not. And one of the things that's sort of happening now that I think makes this even more complicated is, for a long time we were told that I certainly grew up right with the notion that a Taino identity was not necessarily a real thing, right? That was something that had been subsumed, right, within the larger kind of Spanish culture of the islands. And then we had, the African element, which was also subsumed, but more so underneath folklore. And that's a whole other issue too, right? Because there is a problem within Puerto Rican culture of not seeing Blackness in the contemporary, right? And so, one of the things that is sort of controversial now, and I think that, so many of us are trying to make sense of, is there is something that's being referred to as the Taino revival movement, right? Which is happening both in Puerto Rico and also here in the diaspora, particularly like here in the New York and New Jersey region, where people are trying to sort of reclaim that kind of identity, right? And trace their sort of lineage. And I say it's controversial because there's a bit of pushback about that too, about like, well, you're so far removed from this. And it's important that we recognize that there are indigenous communities that actually are really tied, right, to specific people, to a people, right, that exist in the present moment. So it's not to discredit it, but I bring it up to you because from my particular location, right, it's a really kind of fraught and complicated, controversial sort of issue. But nonetheless, I do want to raise the fact that I think that for so many of us, we have not been taught that any of our culture is indigenous, right? I think that especially for those of us who, are children of immigrants, or, for those of us who are even third generation or beyond, you're sort of told that you sort of get the sense that all of that comes from the Spanish culture that we inherited, right, via colonialization. So I think that, it's a tough conversation. It's tough to track. To complicate this even further, 2 years ago, my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, I had found out that her parents, so my great-grandparents, migrated to Puerto Rico, and that my great-grandmother was indigenous from Peru, and her husband was a Spaniard. And that really complicated, sort of like thinking about like your roots. And I say this to you because my story, I don't think that story is unique. For many of you, as you start to track back even just like 2 or 3 generations, you'll start to see that there's tons of movement in Latin America, right? And there's sort of roots that we haven't discussed either, right? Like there are major like Asian migrations happening, right, in many countries in Latin America, and that has like informed many of us in terms of our backgrounds. And the same could be said too also for Middle Eastern migrations. So I know I'm not giving you an easy answer because it is something that's really difficult to trace. And I do have to say that it's only in recent years that I have really thought about this seriously. I think, I sort of came to this through my own research where, the book that I wrote dealt with how audiences are making sense of representations of Latinos in both English language and Spanish language media in the US. One of the major issues was this question of racial identity, right? Like, so why is it that we don't see indigenous and Black people in Latino representations, right? Both in terms of thinking about how the mainstream thinks of us here in the US, but also within Spanish language productions. And I think, we can get into this a little bit more later in terms of, like my sort of sense of that representation. But I think that, for many of us, this is kind of it is something that as a Latino community that we're only beginning to grapple with. And so I think it's really important that, that we're foregrounding this today.
Yeah. Well, my experience with the indigenous aspect is also new, and it's something I grew up with, and I really wasn't aware. My parents come from Bolivia, and my mom, she comes from a small town called Tiwanaku. Tiwanaku is was the capital of the Aymara Empire, and she grew up speaking Aymara. I would listen to her have conversations with my grandmother in Aymara. And my father was the type of person who would say, no, no, don't talk that indigenous language. You know, we are more sophisticated now. We have to talk el buen español, the good Spanish. Uh, but a great part of Bolivian culture is very indigenous, is identify as indigenous. Even Bolivian, the way they talk Spanish. So certain words I grew up with, I thought they were Spanish, but they were actually Aymara, like wawa. Uh, they would say something like, pick up the wawa, pick up the baby. Wawa is baby, but I thought wawa was, you know, Spanish. Or cara, chiara. Chiara means black, cara means white. Inilla. So these are all indigenous Aymara words. And the same thing goes for some of the foods that Bolivians eat. Sahta, holke, timpu, charque, and some of these food, you also hear it in Peru. Very similar dances as well. So the indigenous part is closely connected to. If you look at some of these countries like Peru, the northern part of Chile, Ecuador, uh, they have this. It's infused in their society, but many of them don't want to see it that way. So I'll talk to some of my family members in Bolivia, and I'll tell them, you know, this is a very indigenous country, and they'll get upset at me for saying these things. And I said, but some of the languages, some of the customs that you make. I mean, um, when you do a blessing, you do something called a chaya, and this is an indigenous ritual. And they'll say something like, "Oh, we have to do the blessing to the Pachamama, the Virgin Pachamama." So even the Virgin Mary has an indigenous name. It's Mother Earth, Pachamama, and they talk like this. This is part of their daily experience. They have these indigenous roots and customs, but they just don't see it. It takes a while. So I had a conversation with my siblings about this and the fact that we still do this. When somebody has bad luck, we say an expression. It's quencherio. And they said, is that Spanish? And that I said, no, it's not Spanish. Quencherio is Aymara. It means that there's some type of bad element going on. I'm like, oh, okay. But it was part of it. We just don't recognize. We don't see it. And the indigenous has been ignored because of the history of Latin America. It has been a history of trying to whiten it, trying to make it more European. And the indigenous was always a taboo. It was something that they did not want to see. This is why people would change their names. They would tell their children not to talk Aymara. It sounds very similar to what we see here when it comes to immigrants from Hispanic, from Latin American countries.
Okay, so as for me, growing up, I was aware of my indigenous descent because my grandmother spoke the native language of her town, which is Quechua, which is spoken throughout Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. Um, you know, a few words have been integrated into my daily vocabulary, serving as a reminder of my roots. However, growing up, I did not feel very close to this identity because most people did not infer that I was indigenous by my appearance. In Ecuador, they use these terms mono and cuy to describe people. Mono meaning people of the coast, or more often so people of black descent, and then cuy to describe people of indigenous descent. And while these terms could seem offensive, given that mono means monkey and that cuy means guinea pig, most of the time these are inoffensive terms, especially when used between the people that identify themselves with these terms. It's more so seen as something to say, oh, you are a mono, so we are the same. So now we can relate on some sort of things. But of course, these terms are hurtful when they're used to be hurtful. But um, when in the street, when someone would call out to me or would first interact with me, they would always say, "Oh, you, it is Mona. You are a monkey." So that kind of gave a separation between my indigenous identity and my black identity, because how people saw me was first mostly by my black identity. So it kind of created a removal from the identity that I felt within myself. And also by the nature of my mother's side being Indigenous, I didn't feel like as a whole, because I couldn't identify as 100% Indigenous. I also felt like I was some sort of imposter within the community because I had another side of me that could not relate or did not share the same language, the same cultures, the same perspectives on. So that was definitely something that kind of created a divide. And also, but I think when that changed was actually a very particular moment. Was in middle school, I was asked to research the origins of my last name. My first last name is Salas, which is a Spanish last name, but my second last name is Sinchi, which is actually the name of one of the indigenous leaders in the Andes. So I think at that point, a lot of my perception of self-identity changed, and it became closer to my indigenous roots because I said, why this last name Sinchi, which is quite common in Ecuador, and it's seen as something bad because it is tied to indigenous roots. And I thought to myself, why is it something to be ashamed of if it carries like the name, the legacy of such a powerful leader? Why is it something that I should be ashamed of? Why is it something I have to hide or try to cover up in some sort of way or another? So at that point, I think I tried to turn my own narrative and discover more about my own indigenous identity.
I think what we've seen a trend is that although there's been some separation of our descent or of our indigenous descent, we still see it in a way, and that really combats the idea that it's after colonization, all the roots and all the heritage has been erased from Latin America, which from our panelists we see that it's still alive, and now I think Dr. Baez mentioned it, there's a revival of it. And moving in the direction that Dr. Baez was guiding us with her answer, we want to again engage our audience, and we want to do a poll and ask the question of how did your community in which you grew up portray indigenous groups? And we have the options of positive, neutral, or no portrayal at all. So if you could go to the link and use the code. Just a few more seconds, and so far we see that there's not really been a lot of portrayal, but it's evenly split between negative, neutral, and there's one instance that is positive. So I think we can end the poll now and direct the question to our panelists. How did your community view indigenous groups when in the community in which you grew up, and did it affect the way in which you viewed yourself?
I think in terms of, my experience in terms of portrayals was, growing up, it was that there were very few representations of Indigenous people. And I'm going to put this in two different categories. First of all, in English language media, I never saw any representation of indigenous Latinos, right? There were a few representations of Latinos, and even those that were Latino had like a very kind of sort of, ambiguous sort of like identity and look. That did not mark them necessarily as indigenous. And certainly no one who was not Latino ever even thought of Latinos as being indigenous, right? There is this sort of, at least as I was growing up, this sense that Latinos are a race in and of themselves, right? Without sort of understanding that kind of complex history that we were talking about earlier. And the few times that I did, in on terms of Spanish language television, indigenous people were, for the most part, invisible. And the few times that I did see them represented were usually as servants, to be honest with you, on telenovelas, right? And they usually played very small roles doing that. So they not only were they the servants, but they also were not, they weren't well-developed characters either. And very kind of sort of side characters. And of course, working in like a very rich, affluent, white family, right? So there was this sort of distinction made there, right, in terms of not only class but also race. So I would say it largely was about invisibility, and and the few times that we saw them, it was very limited and just relegated to those kinds of roles. I think that the other, that's shifting a little bit for a number of reasons. I think one, there's a lot more attention on social media being pushed for more thinking about like racial diversity within Latino communities in terms of the Afro Latino movement. And more so now we're starting to see more visibility with indigenous Latinos. And I also think too, some of this also has to do with the growing sort of language revitalization programs that are happening, right? So, we have much more access, for example, to learning about indigenous cultures in Latin America, and specifically to learning indigenous languages, than we ever had before. So, in my case, the language that Tainos spoke, Arawak, is not, it's not spoken in the version spoken would be very different. And it's not a living language, right? It's not a language that people speak today. But I had the opportunity to take Mixteco, which I've been studying for a year. And even though that's not, like that's not tied to my particular background, for me, it was important because it was an indigenous living language. And because up until now, there have been very few opportunities to learn indigenous languages, right? So I think all of us should be learning these languages because so much gets lost once these languages are no longer spoken. We forget that like culture is encoded into those languages. And there's so much, I think, too, that I've even learned about sort of what got lost in terms of the colonization, in terms of thinking about things like family structure, how societies were organized in very different ways than the way that we think of Latin America today. And then just, like knowledge, people have local knowledge, right, about like agriculture, plants, herbs, that are all sort of like encoded in the language in which you will not have access to unless you really start to learn these languages. And once you start to learn them, then I think it kind of blows your mind a little bit, because then you start to realize, and Ray was talking about this a bit, how much of the the culture that you thought that you were being raised in is not so much Spanish, but it certainly is infused, right, with these indigenous, sort of ways of understanding, right, like knowledge. But they're not marked that way, and they have been sort of subsumed and erased, and that's not a mistake too. I also want to say that those are like, sort of state-sponsored government decisions, right, in terms of making many of these Latin American nations sort of de-indigenized, so to speak, right? Like I was recently reading a book about El Salvador, and that it is not that indigenous people do not live in El Salvador, but it is that like from the 1930s on, the government had decided that they were not going to label these indigenous groups, right? So what happens is they sort of get erased, and it's very similar to what Ray was saying, which is people sort of lose their ties, right, to a particular people, but nonetheless, they're seeing in terms of like their ways of life as they pass them down into the generations, that some of that is still there. We're just not seeing it as indigenous. Or we're not taught to see it as indigenous, is what I mean to say.
And just to add on, I mean, back to the colonization part, we are a product of colonization, not only but mentally and psychologically. One of the sayings that lots in my family and my circles would, when somebody would go out or man who was white, was, oh, you're going to improve the race, la raza. And I would hear this a lot, and I would question, it's like, mejorar. Or they would say, oh, congratulations, your baby is blanquito. She has. So there has been these concepts going when it comes to rejecting or pushing away the indigenous. In Bolivia, it's interesting how the people there have gone through different stuff for them. By the way, it's Bolivian indigenous identity has been an ongoing issue since that country. And I remember going there in the 1990s, visiting my family. This was the era of neoliberalism, with Bolivia and the rest of Latin America really, really towards the United States for guidance, and they really wanted to bring in everything that was America. This was, the end of the Cold War, and the U.S. was the super, and they wanted to bring everything, and they wanted to imitate everything that was happening in from 90210 to the music to every single aspect. And I was living this. So when I went there, people would say, "Oh, he's the Americano. Welcome. Try this, try that," and so on. And I remember going back a couple of 2002, in which half a decade have passed, and neoliberalism failed in Bolivia. And I went there, and all of my friends and family members who rejected the indigenous, who were embracing Americanism, had a different type of no. Now we really want to be, we want to touch our roots. Your policies affected us, and things that were taboo in the 90s, in early 2000, were very acceptable, very mainstream. Chewing coca, chewing the coca leaf was reserved for indigenous people. But when I went there in 2000, young people were chewing coca. Young middle class, upper class people were chewing a form of resistance. And this led to the election of Evo Morales into became the plurinational state of Bolivia, which recognizes unity of their indigenous groups. So this is look at Bolivia. Now we have another cycle that's rejecting the indigenous. No. We want to go back to Christian European values that we had in the past. 12 years of Evo Morales. So we have these inner battles that go on and even inside of us. I think that there is an inner indigenous identity inside of us that's asking us to be free, voice for recognition. And I think we should give it some space, give it some voice by getting in touch with our indigenous roots, and that being learning an indigenous language, learning the history of some of these indigenous groups, seeing how they live.
Before we get into Diana's answer, one of the members of our audience, Anna, she texted that as an Ecuadorian, my family spoke Quechua. I didn't realize it was Spanish until I spoke Spanish in school and they didn't understand. The language also makes me feel closer to my roots. So I think Anna relates to the experience that Diana has had.
I'm really glad. I also was not aware that some of these words that I was using in my daily life um, weren't Spanish. I just assumed that they were. For example, something really simple like achachay, which means I'm cold. I just assumed that that was like a common Spanish expression when in fact it wasn't. So once I came to the United States and I, used these words in school, people didn't understand what I was trying to say. And that's when I realized that there was a divide between, you know, um, like being indigenous and not being indigenous, and how these two identities have become kind of merged, being Latino and Hispanic, and having to deal with the this indigenous identity outside of your home country, especially. And then growing up, or even now still, the same notions exist that the indigenous people are dumb, the people that still speak Quechua, that they are uncivilized, or they don't have the capability to learn Spanish, so that they therefore have like a reduced mental capability. And this is something that I think there's a resistance in the younger generation to try to take back this word as indigenous and reclaim it for ourselves and say that yes, we are indigenous, and no, speaking an indigenous language does not make you less than anybody else. It does not change how academically smart you are. It doesn't change what you're capable of doing. And we've seen, at least in Ecuador, I've seen that there's a bigger movement to have more indigenous people in government, especially, and represent because we do still have quite a large Quechua speaking community, even if it is decreasing I think every year we see a decrease in the amount of people that speak Quechua, because it is not something that is necessarily desirable anymore, as Spanish becomes more integrated into our community. And even now English, we have to deal with that as well, in a more globalized world. Quechua seems to be decreasing in its significance and importance. So rather than passing on these indigenous languages or indigenous cultures, we're more focused on trying to advance ourselves, quote unquote, and keep up with the Americans, as they say. So I would say that the indigenous people are still viewed negatively in general, by society as a whole, or at least in Ecuador they are. But even those, as Dr. Tapia was talking about, even those that are indigenous themselves kind of reject this notion of indigeneity, because they don't want to be associated with not knowing or not having enough knowledge or not having enough money. But of course, there's going to be like a rebel side that wants to fight against it. But the general movement we see is a negative view of indigenous people, and it has definitely affected. Well, it did affect the way I viewed myself, because I kind of fed into these thoughts that, oh, I must not be intelligent enough, that I cannot achieve enough in life because of the certain notions that are placed on you just because of who you are. But I have, as I said, this has kind of changed throughout the recent years. So I'm definitely on the rebel side, in which I think that we have to reclaim our language and our culture, so that we can keep our traditions moving. Because at the end of the day, I find it really hard to see these words that are like in our daily vocabulary to be erased completely. So we might as well keep those traditions and cultures alive that have like existed for so long, because they tie us to who we are and explain maybe how we think and how like our culture functions.
I think, like our panelists have said, there is a big movement now of reclaiming what was originally in our roots, and although there's some resistance, and there has to be a change in the paradigm of how we see the world as divided between civilized or incivil or not civilized, which is usually associated with indigenous groups, and then that is how it then portrayed in the media, and we often see in telenovelas, in movies, like Dr. Baez mentioned, more light skinned looking actors, even though they appear to represent Latin America. So it just shows the limited uh, information that producers might have about really the richness of our roots. So now we are moving on to our fourth and last question, which is, how did you gain awareness or became more educated on your indigenous heritage, and has it changed your identity as a Latino, Hispanic?
For me, this has been an ongoing journey, and so much of this is just tied to education. I think, like many, Latinos growing up in the US, I was taught very little about Latin American or Caribbean history, um, let alone like about the history of like Latinos in the US. And so I very much had inherited whatever, my parents and my grandparents thought about their identities, right? Coming from the island. It wasn't really until college. And to be honest with you, I ended up taking a Puerto Rican history class my sophomore year because nothing else was open. And it happened to fulfill like one of the general education requirements. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And for me, that was like the beginning of the journey, because that class starts with like pre-conquest, like the Caribbean in like pre-colonial times, which I had like never even thought about, right? Like that was just like so far out, even though that's so like central to our identities today, the conquest, right? Like it determines basically like who we are today. I hadn't really thought about it because I hadn't really studied it, right? Outside of like very loosely, mentioning Columbus, right, as discovering the Americas. Which, by the way, they don't even tell you, right, that he stops in the Caribbean first, right? So you're not even though like we're central to that history, problematic history, even that we're not taught, right? So for me, that was the beginning of the journey, and that just like really opened my mind. I mean, after that, I took more classes. I read whatever books I could get my hands on. Fast forward much later, I would decide to go to graduate school and continue studying, some of these issues. And like I said, it's continuing to grow for me, right? I have only been studying this indigenous language. It's almost a year now, but I'm hoping to like continue to learn. And I think, it's important for all of us to like really challenge ourselves in terms of not just how we think about ourselves, but just like the Latino community as a whole, right? There's so much diversity within that community. And there's so much work for us to do in terms of, learning our own history, but then also, figuring out ways to get others to understand who we are too, because they think that there are major misconceptions from outside of Latino communities about, who Latinos are. And, indigeneity is one of those things that I think, from my perspective, seems to be totally lost on this larger, within our larger culture. And in that sense, I really appreciated, Diana, your story about, having to fill out those forms, because that's a big part of it, right? Is how people are forced to like assimilate into these categories here. That certainly like are not, fully describing like, their background, right? And who they really, what communities they really are coming from and representing. So yeah, so it's ongoing for me.
Well, for me, it actually started when I joined the Marine Corps, and it's tied to the reasons why I joined the Marine Corps as a young man. Um, I I don't think we are recognized as Americans, the browner we are. So in the Latinx, the reason why I say this is because even in the Latinx community, when our parents refer to as an Americano, they are not referring to you or to me or to brown or black people. So when my mom says, uh, she married an Americano or he married an Americana, they're not, we're not included in that. They're specifically talking about white people. So I didn't feel that I was American enough as a child, and I said, okay, I'll join the Americans. Maybe I'll join the Marines, and maybe this way I could be more American. And the opposite happened. I actually learned to be more Latino because it was the first time I interacted with Chicano Marines. And Chican, we didn't talk about Chicanos, by the way, at all. Chicanx, these people completely blew my mind. These were Marines, patriotic Marines. For me, growing up as a child, I was embarrassed to talk in Spanish. These guys were talking Spanish left and right in front of the drill instructor. And they would say things like, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And they would talk about brown pride, things I never heard as an East Coast Latino. But they were so proudful. And so I hanged out with these Chicanos, and we would talk a lot of Spanish, and we would talk about brown pride, and we would pick on other young Marines, young private Marines who we would, if they had a Hispanic name and they didn't speak Spanish, we would pick on them and say, how come you don't speak Spanish? Or I remember Private Jimenez. He said, my name is Private Jimenez. And we yelled at him. We said, no, your last name is Jimenez. Don't Americanize it. And it goes to the point where, when did I discover I had indigenous roots? Well, there was this one guy, Private Johnston. We approached him, Private Johnston. He looked very, very Mexican. That's what Corporal Ruiz said. He said, and he goes to him, and we look at him. He said, Private Johnston, where'd you get that gringo last name? That's how he said it in Spanish. And ¿de dónde conseguiste ese apellido gringo? And he looks at it, it's like, I don't speak Spanish. And at this point, Ruiz is having a heart attack, and he says to him, you have the face of Moctezuma. You don't speak Spanish? And Private Johnson looks at it and says, I don't. I speak Navajo. I'm Native American. I'm Native American like you guys. He said, where are you from? He said, well, my parents are Mexican. You're an Aztec warrior. He says, where are you from? I said, well, my parents are from Bolivia. Or you're Quechua, Inca warrior. And he says, and you guys, it's very pathetic because you come and asking me, because not only did you learn the language of the first colonizer, you learned the language of the other colonizer. I don't speak, you don't even speak your identity. It was taken away from you. You don't speak your indigenous language. And, we looked at each other, like, oh, we're indigenous? This blew us away. And we looked at us, yes, look, he looks like us. We're brothers. We're somehow related. So this was it. And as I grew older, I wanted to really get into this topic, and it's something that it intrigued me. So just reading the works of Roxana Dunbar Ortiz, an amazing book she has, The People's History of Indigenous People Here in the U.S., and Vine Delora Custer, Died for Our Sins. I recommend you guys reading those books. It's a manifesto of the ongoing war on indigenous people, and you could see how this goes on not only in the U.S. but in Canada and Latin America.
Diana, you're muted.
My bad. Okay, so the way I gained awareness and educated myself was definitely through discussing my background with my grandmother. She was definitely able to give me the most insight on where we had come from, how she had lost the language herself. For example, she told me that, I think she said that either a university or a company had gone to her town, and they had told the people that they needed to speak Spanish because that's how the only way that they were going to succeed in life, so that they could, interact with the Americans who had already done enough by learning Spanish, so that they had to learn Spanish so that they could interact with them. And she was telling me about how these slowly these American people in our land began to shape the how we viewed ourselves, because prior to that there wasn't a shame in being indigenous, but suddenly with the introduction of different people you begin to feel shame, and you begin to feel as an other, as you are not doing something correctly because you are not like the rest. You then become a marginalized group in your own eyes. So through that I was able to learn about how the indigenous community has changed in my town, at least throughout the years, and how we have lost some customs, and we have lost a lot of people have lost the language. She herself does not speak the way she used to. She can only remember a few words now, the words that are like used in our daily vocabulary. um, but then also reading about academic works, even at school, um, have been really impactful. Viewing them through a different lens, even if they are speaking about just Hispanic or Latino identities, how they compare to my own experiences and how they compare to the experiences of other indigenous people. And it has the way this has changed my identity is I've definitely become I've kind of strayed away from like this initial like white Latina identity to accept the the indigenous and Black identity that I have, um, and have become proud of those identities, and have tried to be more in touch with that. And yeah, that's what I'm trying to do at Penn. Unfortunately, because of COVID, things have definitely changed. But I hope to definitely not only learn the language, but also learn more about my people and then other people as well.
And I really hope that is a pattern that we continue seeing with our panels. We've seen different experiences, different perspectives, because they each have different backgrounds, um, and and it is really one of my concerns to educate, and it's really the mission of Adelante to educate and inform people. And although we might not share the same experiences, we're really glad that we were able to bring people who themselves know about the topic and can speak from their own personal experiences, and bring, like Catherine said at the beginning, light to this identity that's been pushed down on for many years, and then uh, in a way force Latinos to be unaware of the complexity of who we are, and limited to just one term or one label. In Mark, that like Diana said, I also had the experience in school of just checking that box of Hispanic Latino, and you can't even say that anything else. Sometimes you're just limited to that. So thank you so much. Now we're gonna move on to our last section, where if anybody in the audience has any questions, we really encourage you to leave uh, your question on the chat, or if you would like to ask the question directly to our panelists, you can also use the raise your hand function, which is on the upper side of your screen. So Amy Baez.
Oh, okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I have two questions. So one would be, what, I guess, sort of advice would you give to members of like the Latinx or Hispanic community that don't identify as Indigenous, but want to respect the Indigenous community? Like, what advice do you give to them to help like aid and uplift the Indigenous community, if that makes sense?
If we could get one panelist to answer. this question?
I'll take it. I think I just had this conversation with my wife. She's very light-skinned Colombian, and she mentioned this. She said, "I never had a problem identifying with being indigenous in Colombia." And me and my dad, we stared at each other, and he said, "Because you really don't look indigenous." And so she said, she asked us, how can I help? Well, and I said, in Colombia, there are indigenous communities. Maybe your area did not have a big indigenous population, but Colombia is rich in La Guajira, in El Putumayo. There's a history of indigenous people who are also migrating to Bogota, to Pereira, to the major cities. So I would recommend you looking at the history of wherever your country of your ethnicity is from, and you'll find indigenous history, and it's throughout the Avaliaba, it's throughout the Americas. There's a rich every part, even here. This is New Jersey's Lenape land. It's indigenous territory.
Thank you. That was actually really helpful. And then the second question I have is, was there a specific moment where you were like, wow, I'm really proud to be indigenous? Like I feel really prideful right now.
Could we get a different panelist to answer this question?
I would definitely say, while I'm not Bolivian, moment that made me really proud was when Evo Morales won. I think that really changed the perspective in which I found myself, because I myself want to be a politician. That I think really encouraged me to try to reach the same goals that he did, because I was like, if he can do it, then I can do it, right? And then after Evo Morales was elected, I saw a different movement in Ecuador as well. It encouraged a lot of indigenous people to try and be politicians and try to, get their voices out there, be represented, and represent the communities that can't do that for themselves. So I think that was a moment in which I was like, wow, this is something greater than myself, something that can really change a revolution. And him being indigenous, I think, not only inspired me, but inspired a really big movement within the greater indigenous community in the Andes.
We're going to take one last question, and if we can also get one panelist to answer to the question, we'll give it a few seconds. Okay, go ahead, Larry.
So mine isn't really a question, but since no one was raising their hand, I just wanted to say thank you to you guys, because personally, like, I'm Dominican and I'm come from a very urban city, so I personally have never almost encountered indigenous people or have been taught about the indigenous nature of people. So it was very helpful to listen to you guys, and I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, we as Adelante, we feel extremely lucky to have speakers like you who are believers of this the importance of indigenous roots. I personally don't hear much about it within my circle, my community, and that's why these questions were focused on how you live as people within the Latino community and the Hispanic community. Now we're wrapping up with the event, and we just want to again highlight some of the ideas that our panelists have shared. The idea of pushing down the trend of pushing down the indigenous roots, the role of colonization that has created the desire to associate with more of our white descent, whether it is Spanish or and how identities have merged all throughout Latin America, the Spanish, the Black, the Indigenous. And like Dr. Baez said, there's also some coming from Asia, from the Middle East. And ultimately, we have now seen a trend of revival of indigeneity, which through our speakers, we've seen that it's done through learning the language, which is crucial to reconnecting with the culture of Indigenous groups. So we want to thank, again, our excellent panelists, our co-sponsors, and our audience for participating. We know it's a Thursday, but this is a really important conversation to have, a really great discussion, and we really hope that the panel has sparked that curiosity, that interest on the topic, and want you to become an advocate and ally if you don't identify yourself as Indigenous, and also give this a platform for Indigenous voices. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Daniela, can I make a really quick announcement just
Yes,
related
yes.
to this? For
course.
anyone who wants to learn an Indigenous language, the CUNY Mexican Studies Institute offers classes in Mixteco, Nahuatl, and Quechua. Daniela, I don't have like the function to be, the chat is not working, so I can't put the link for it. But it's their online classes. They are and they are free. They ask for a donation of $25, but if you don't have that, that's okay too. So I put that out there because it's like a very like cheap, you know, it's very learn a language. You know, that's how I've been learning Mixteco, and you get to meet people from like all over the country and sometimes even from Latin America. So if that's something you're interested in, it's like an easy, you know, way to sort of begin to learn the language.
Thank you, Dr. Baez. I will later ask you to send me that link so we can share it with our community who's not present right now, but so we can share it on our social media as well as our email. Thank you. I think that, like you said, the language really contains the culture, and it's a way to feel it present. We have within the Latino community, I think many words, and Diana has said achachay or alalau, multiple, and they are really part of our daily lives. And even if they're not, there's always a chance to educate ourselves and to learn more. So thank you, everybody, once again, in the name of Adelante. We're really happy that we were able to have this event, and good evening.